You're listening to Real Estate Radio Washington, D.C. Metro on the Big Talker 1580. Now, live in studio, your host, local real estate expert, Ryan Sloper.
Welcome, Washington, D.C. Metro, to Ryan Sloper's Real Estate Radio, the most important hour of radio every Monday on 1580 AM, the Big Talker. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. For those of you who are not familiar, Real Estate Radio is a show dedicated to building the Washington, D.C. Metro's housing and credit markets one house at a time. Within every market, there are solutions as well as tremendous opportunities. You just need some trusted advice. That is my message, and I will be delivering it to you guys every Monday from 2 to 3 p.m. right here on 1580 AM, the Big Talker. Joining me on our panel this afternoon is Louis Cammarosano, the general manager of HomeGain. Louis is often cited in the media as an industry expert in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, CNN Money, Fox Business, Smart Money, MSN, and numerous others. We're going to discuss with you in our segment on Word on Wealth about what happened in the markets last week, as well as letting you know what is on deck for this coming week and how it's going to affect your real estate, your mortgages, your credit, anything related to real estate. Louis, you there today?
I'm here, Ryan. How are you today?
You know, I'm doing pretty well. I've been kind of bogged down by this feels like 150-degree weather out here on the East Coast. It's craziness.
Didn't that match your 101 fever you had last week?
Yeah, I don't know. It must be something. When you're coming off of, a cold or something like that, it seems like things just tend to get worse. And it was like that weather just threw me in even more of a tizzy. It's amazing because they were actually, I don't know if you saw any of the news reports, but they were taking and putting steaks and these little tin pans and putting them inside on the dashboard, and 2 hours later they're cooked like medium rare. I mean, it was incredible how hot, and now we finally got our first, big rainstorm in, so it's going to cool the temperatures off probably by tomorrow, but now we got to deal with the humidity for the rest of the day.
Just makes a sauna out of it.
Yeah, it's like a swampland right now, so it's pretty disgusting. But, we got a lot on tap today, Louis. There's been a lot going on. Obviously, most of the headlines have been predominantly dominated by two things. The NFL lockout coming to an end. That's the first thing. And the second thing is the debt ceiling, what the politicians are going to do as far as figuring out what to do with our budget deficit and actually raising the debt limit. It just seems like we're in the same place that we were 3 weeks ago. We're really not making any headway. It looks like this is just going to come down to the wire of who's going to give in first.
Ryan, we've been in the same situation for 40 years. They've been talking about debt reduction.
Exactly.
We can't expect them to figure it out in 2 weeks.
Well, weren't the Congress supposed to pass an actual, or the Senate was supposed to pass an actual budget this past April, I believe. And, things are always going to linger down to the last minute. But, I'm getting really disgusted at just how – obviously this has been the same thing going on for 40-some years. But it's just, if they care about the economy and all that, then you wouldn't throw all of this uncertainty into it in a time where we already have enough of it.
Sure. It's very simple, Ryan, for them or the president to say that we will not default on the debt and that you don't necessarily have to raise the debt ceiling to do it.
Yep.
They can simply agree that they're going to pay the bondholders, if that's what they're claiming the Armageddon is going to come from, and that they're going to prioritize the other debts that they owe, Social Security, Armed Forces payments, and so on, and that they may have to temporarily suspend or permanently cut non-essential costs, and they'll deal with that when they deal with that. But right now what they've done is they've decided they need to have a grand deal that they're going to solve everything, all or nothing. They're either going to raise the debt ceiling and come up with a grand plan, or we're going to have Armageddon. And we saw this during the banker bailout, too, that either we pay the $800 million or the world collapses.
Yep.
And if really it's that bad that if we don't pay our debts to the bondholders, there's enough revenue coming in right now. I think it's 20% would go to debt service. It can be paid.
Yeah.
So what they're trying to do is they're trying to posture to get the best possible deal on either side.
Yeah.
And therefore risking what they've already called Armageddon, which I don't think it would be. But the point is, if they really believe that, they would at least square that away and say we're not going to default on our debt, and we're going to have to find the cuts elsewhere.
It's interesting because it's like, they're all bogged down by this, this drop dead date. And as seen by the whole banking collapse, when we made them, we basically decided to do QE1 and QE2, which really didn't do too much to the economy. They say that, if we didn't do it, all would have collapsed. But, you can argue that point. So really. I mean, I think it is as simple as the president coming out with simple language, as Ben Bernanke can tend to sway the market one way or the other by what he says. The president could do the same thing and at least give stability back to the market. I mean,
but he's not interested in stability. He's interested in getting reelected.
Exactly, and that's the main point is that this is nothing more than just political banter back and forth about who wants to win the next election, and it's basically just a showdown. That's all it really is.
It truly is, and de Tocqueville said one of the main flaws in the Constitution maybe was that the president should serve a 6-year term, because he is worried that if the deal doesn't go his way, he doesn't want to be negotiating debt limit again in the summer and fall of 2012 when he's trying to get reelected.
Right.
Because reelection in this country, it's a $1 billion event. He's going to be running across the country. He wants to run on whatever record he may have, not on what he's doing minute by minute during the debt crisis.
Exactly. And, what this, as far as this, relates back to real estate, I mean, it's just all this uncertainty obviously is putting pressure on treasuries and everything else because, there is, I believe the market's starting to price in a bit of insurance premiums based on concerns that the rating agencies may lower the U.S. credit rating, which it won't probably happen. They're just going to keep threatening that it will happen. I think they've lowered it down to maybe I think PIMCO said now that there's a 50% chance that they could actually change their credit rating from AAA down to a AA plus or something.
But Ryan, isn't it quite fascinating that even though there is some downgrading of the bonds in the market, meaning the interest rates are slightly higher, that they're really not as high as they otherwise would be? If you think about it, the United States has a AAA credit rating, and yet it's known worldwide that the U.S. is the largest debtor in the world, owes $14 trillion, and is having trouble coming up with a plan whether they can pay it or not, and they still have a AAA rating.
Yeah, it is pretty incredible.
If you knew a debtor like this who owed so much money and was constantly trying to figure out how they might be able to pay you, you wouldn't deem him a good credit risk. And you'd want a lot more interest back for loaning that person money.
Yeah, and I believe I read some report. I believe it's 40 cents of every dollar is going towards our debt right now.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a staggering number when you think about it. And a lot of this, we can get this under control. It's just that we choose not to. And I think that's the most frustrating thing to me. And I sit here and I'm paying attention to what's going on with mortgage-backed securities and how that ties into interest rates. And I'm looking at the stock market, and you know what? It just doesn't make sense. There's so much artificial stuff going on right now with what the Fed's doing with manipulating. Like they already have contingency plans in place in case the debt ceiling is not raised, which what are they going to do? Come in and basically pay the interest on these treasuries, or just basically put like a forbearance on them?
Well, Ryan, one thing I think Ron Paul suggested is the reverse, that all the treasuries that the Fed bought, that the U.S. shouldn't pay those back.
Right.
That's like over $1 trillion. That would solve your problem right there.
Yeah.
Well, it's other problems, but still, it is a creative solution.
Yeah.
Because they bought those treasuries with money they printed out of thin air.
Yep. You're listening to Real Estate Radio. I'm your host, Ryan Sloper, joined by my guest, Louis Cammarosano, the general manager of HomeGain. Quick reminder before we jump into our next segment, if you have any questions regarding any real estate or credit-related topics that we cover today, you can call the off-air phone number. It's 877-245-2030. That's 877-245-2030. That's an off-air number. It'll go. Just leave a message, and we'll get back with you by the end of the day. Now we're going to jump into this week's Word on Wealth segment, where we give an overview of what happened in the market last week and anything that's going to impact you, the consumer, financially. This segment was brought to you by HomeGain. HomeGain is the place to get you started buying or selling a home, finding a realtor, and getting real estate questions answered. So you can go to homegain.com today to see what I'm talking about. All you have to do is type in your home address, and you will get an instant free estimate of your home's value online. It's a great way to monitor your home's value, and it's totally free. Check it out today at homegain.com. So I know last week, actually 2 weeks ago, we talked a lot about jobs and how they had tanked. This week is more about inflation. Tame inflation is great for mortgage rates. If it ticks up, then mortgage rates will worsen. And I've obviously said that inflation is inevitable with, the amount of money that we're printing. And, Louis, you and I have been, kind of wrong in thinking that interest rates were going to spike sooner rather than later. And they've kind of stayed relatively, right there in that high mid 4.5 range, which is incredible with everything that we have going on. And I mean, I'm happy that that has happened, because it's a lot of opportunities out there for potential, first-time buyers or move-up buyers, or those people looking to buy their dream home if they can obtain those jumbo financing, which is a whole other issue. But on last Monday, there was more discussions regarding the budget crisis, which had the market down. The politicians, like we were just talking about, are like, little kids in a sandbox, basically throwing sand back at each other, not really coming up with anything that's going to be for the benefit of this country that they can get done now. And, Louis, you and I were just talking. I mean, it doesn't really make sense to just go ahead and just ram something through just because. I mean, this needs to be a sensible plan. Don't you agree?
So it has to be. They're talking about a grand plan, which takes months to hammer out and negotiate, and they're trying to do it in a week, unless it's just posturing, when they really need to change how they do business. When they're approving spending during the year, they're never thinking that, oh, well, wait a minute, we may not have enough money to do this.
Right.
And if they don't come up with a change in how they do business, saying that we don't raise the debt ceiling, that's why we have one, and we're only going to spend up to or below the debt ceiling, or otherwise we're going to have to make cuts, then you're going to be in this position all the time. And right now, everybody's relying on the fact that they've raised the debt ceiling, 70, 80, 90 times in the past 50 years. That's because that's how they do business.
Right.
It's a given that they're just going to continue to spend beyond their means. And
they justify it by, the debt is not necessarily a big deal as long as it's a certain percentage of the GDP. That's the way they justify it all the time. You know what I mean?
As long as they think they can somehow come back and ask for more money in taxes.
Exactly. Yep. And that's the other thing, in reading into a lot, the Erskine Bowles, where they were basically one of the things that was going to be a big cut was getting rid of the mortgage interest deduction, which is essentially raising taxes. You know what I mean?
Well, they call that closing loopholes.
Yeah, they call it closing loopholes. I call it raising taxes because, in essence, it was for I think they said for $500,000 and less would lose their mortgage interest deduction. Now, obviously, that doesn't really affect non-owner occupied properties, and which on those rental properties you get to write off a ton, right? Well, who typically owns rental properties? People with more money. So
the other thing, though, Ryan, is that when you use these arbitrary numbers, they're not adjusted for regional differences. On the coast, the $500,000 home is a modest home.
Yep.
But elsewhere in the country, that's a very expensive home.
Exactly. Out there on the West Coast where you're at, I mean, that's a completely different ballgame.
Well, you can't even get a home in the San Francisco Bay Area, or at least in San Francisco, for $500,000.
No doubt in my mind. Yeah, and I mean here, in the D.C. metro area, $500,000, you can get a nice single family. Maybe in certain areas, maybe a larger condo or a town.
Still, there's a large percentage of homes that go beyond the $500,000 in your area.
Yes, absolutely.
And therefore no longer get the interest deduction.
Yes, and and that's it's just so silly to me, Louis, though, because they know the Fed has said on numerous occasions that they know how important real estate is to the economy bringing itself back, and to even consider that when they're trying to, get people to be able to buy this so-called, foreclosure inventory, the shadow inventory that's sitting out there. I don't know if you saw, but there was another this has been a rumor, I saw an article on it, something about that the federal government was actually considering maybe instead of selling their foreclosure inventory.
I did see that, yeah.
Renting the properties out. Now, if that's not socialism coming, I mean, what is that?
That's crazy. And Ryan, you mentioned the point when they go after things like the interest mortgage deduction, or when they have cuts, they cut where people feel it first and get mad and then say, oh, I guess we're going to have to give the government more power, we're going to have to raise taxes. They don't cut all the bureaucrats, they don't cut all the useless agencies, they cut what people need.
Yep.
They cut the fire, they cut the police, they're threatening to cut Social Security, they're threatening to take away the mortgage deduction. You don't hear them threatening that we're going to have to shut down the Department of Energy, or we're going to have to shut down the Department of Education. They don't threaten that. To get you nervous, they threaten what you need.
Yep. Yeah,
that's a real problem, because people should be complaining about, well, before you start cutting that, why don't we take a look at all the other things that the government spends money on that no one wants?
Right, because that's going to take away money that's going into the congressman's pocket. That's exactly why. And yeah, I mean, I think that on a whole that the public is really starting to see. I mean, I don't really think most people understand what's really going on with the debt ceiling, but I think that they can really see that it's just mudslinging back and forth.
They don't see it, because the way all everyone, as I've seen in all articles, talks about raising the debt ceiling is essential in order to pay our debts.
Right.
And as if all the debts are equal. So when people are having trouble meeting their debts, they decide which ones are the most important to pay.
Yep.
They don't say, well, unless I get an advance on the credit card, I can't pay for everything.
Right. And what happens when that customer or that consumer runs out of money? What do?
It doesn't make any sense, because if you're leading a very extravagant lifestyle and you're leading it off your credit card, you don't say, well, I can't pay the rent unless I get another $30,000 advance, because not only am I paying the rent, I've got 3 vacations lined up and I'm buying 2 new cars.
Right.
What you do is you don't raise the credit on your card. You pay the rent. You don't take the 3 vacations, and you don't buy the cars.
Yep.
Because the rent is important.
Well, the federal government.
The way they've made it seem is that all of the money needs to be paid. Yep. All of the things that the government has bought, we need.
Right. Exactly. It's
on the same level with the debt, and therefore cutting anything. If you don't raise the debt ceiling, there's Armageddon, because we can't pay the bondholders.
Right. Well,
and that's like the person who's run up to credit saying, look, if I don't get a credit increase, I'm going to get kicked out of my house because I can't pay the rent, which isn't true. If you didn't buy the car and you weren't taking the vacations, you probably could pay your rent.
Exactly. Yeah, well, none of this is really going to change, Lewis, until, the actual campaigns have to be publicly funded campaigns. Because that's the only real way that we can get all this special interest and removed from this whole equation, where it's actually the public that they're representing. I mean, they're not.
Well, that's an interesting point, but then that's also socialism, isn't it?
Yeah, but the thing about it is, Lewis, is that I think we've been under this. We have a socialist system in a way, anyway. I mean, when you look at how much the government owns right now, as far as mortgages and everything else,
or a percentage of the economy,
it's really ridiculous. And I mean, to say that we have a completely democratic society is wrong. I think
we have a democratic society. We don't have a free market society.
Well, that's absolutely true. We definitely don't have a free market, and that's leading us to the problems that are lying down the road when we have the Fed, which is really manipulating interest rates right now with buying all these treasuries, and all of a sudden eventually they have to slowly pull out of it. I don't see how that's going to happen and without interest rates making a substantial jump really fast. And the long-term implications of interest rates rising really fast, I think, are even more strategic defaults, even more foreclosures, because as interest rates,
less job creation, less capital creation, of course.
Right, and obviously we know that the more interest rates rise, prices of homes are going to come down. And I mean, I'm making another prediction. I don't like to do this, but I really do think that we're going to probably by the end of this year, somewhere maybe beginning of next year, I think that we are going to see that double dip come again, because at some point we're going to be forced to have to raise interest rates. I don't know when it is, but when we do, it's not going to, like I said, the Fed might raise it 1/4 point, but I could see our interest rates shooting from 4.5 to 6 really fast.
And this already should have happened. When you have these booms, you have to liquidate the debt, and you have to let the malinvestments fall where they may. We haven't let that happen. You keep trying to pump up the souffle. It's just like an addict. The more he comes down, he needs more to get pushed back up, and eventually he crashes. I mean, you're better off just cleaning up the damage that's been done by the boom right after it happens. But we've now tried to push this thing up for 3 years.
Yeah.
With QE1, QE2, and now they're not talking about, but they're going to do QE3 in some form or another.
They don't have a choice, I don't think. I mean, they'll call it something different. It might be question mark, something -4, but there'll be something there. I mean, who knows? There was an interesting article on the KCM blog that it basically says a 14% home mortgage rate, and a question mark obviously is something like that possible? And with all the talk about a QRM or a qualified residential mortgage, with people having to maybe this obviously hasn't been put in place, but it's one of the bills that's been proposed. So if it is accepted, where people would have to put down 20% down payment. That's just another one of the stupidest things I've ever heard, because really the amount of people that are actually putting down 20% right now and taking loans is not very high. There's a large portion of the people in the United States that are cash buyers right now. There was an interesting article, I can't remember off the top of my head. It was something about 35% of the transactions have been coming in as cash right now. That's a very large number. And very interesting to note that Fannie Mae has now decided that they are going to allow for cash-out refinances if you buy a property with cash. Why would they do that? Because basically what it's doing is it's hurting where they're not able to give people loans. So their investors are going out and paying all cash because they can't get a loan. What makes them think that their credit or anything or their income is going to change for them to be able to do a refinance right behind it to get some of their cash back out?
Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, they don't work on any market-driven precepts.
No. It was interesting because this article had showed that, and I've really noticed this as a general rule of thumb, that all over there's been a lot of hard money lenders popping up. And when I'm talking about hard money lenders, I'm talking guys that are charging 10 to 14%. And there's actually a need for this in the market. Louis, you'd be shocked. I mean, there's investors out there on the streets that are willing to put 20% down to buy a property. They just want, they want the cash. They don't care what the interest rate is because they feel like they're still getting a good deal where they could, get in there, do the work, and flip that house back to somebody else. So there's a big, huge, void of that special financing, what people used to call maybe subprime or alternative financing, that is available. And this guy was showing a Dallas attorney, Joey Messina, has had a side business, and in the past 2 years, he's funded over 20 mortgages, ranging in size from $40,000 to $102,000, and the mortgages were carrying an interest rate of 14%, more than double the rates charged by most banks. Now, I find that very interesting because if somebody's willing to pay 14% and really the going rate on a 30-year fix right now is 4.5%, it shows that there's a big demand, but the demand would seem like it's coming from investors. Would you agree?
It has to. I mean, there's always a demand for people who can't otherwise get funding, and they'll take it at higher rates if they have an opportunity.
Yeah. And I think that, this really just goes to show, I think that, for a lot of people, especially looking for a primary residence right now, you're talking about what rates could get up to at some point versus where they're at right now. Let's just say that in the next 2 to 3 years, interest rates are now up at 7%.
Which is likely.
Which is highly likely. And chances are, somebody's really going to be reconsidering whether they want to purchase at that time. Prices will probably come back down a little bit. Mm-hmm. But I think that, the whole mindset of the buyer at that point will be like, oh, I don't know if I want to buy a house. Rates are at 7%. If I think what's going to happen, what we've been talking about, rents are going to continue to rise. They're going to be in a catch-22 where they're just kind of like, okay, well, now interest rates are at 7% and rents are, shooting through the roof. What do I do? And ultimately, they're probably going to end up trying to purchase a house and then be kicking themselves because they're paying about $300 more dollars a month than they could have if they bought now. I've talked to a lot of people lately, and they're all contemplating, oh, well, I think that the market's going to fall back another 10%. And I tell them, well, the actual cost of home ownership right now is at an all-time low. And
especially if you get the fixed rate, because then your cost of living, your cost of shelter doesn't go up. Whereas when you're renting, if you're not in rent control, your rent is going to go up. As interest rates go up, they're going up as a reflection, as a fight against inflation. That means inflation exists, and so your rent is going to go up with the cost of living adjustment.
Yeah.
Whereas your mortgage, if you have that 15, 30-year fixed mortgage, won't go up if you buy now.
Exactly. And that's so critical because obviously when this inflation kicks in and you have a 4.5% rate, that's going to be outstanding because you're not.
One could argue 4.5% right now is probably lower than the actual inflation rate.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
If you've taken they say the non-core, but if you take into account food and energy, which are your main cost of living, they're higher than 4.5% on an annual basis.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. If you are in a situation where you're currently renting and your rent's getting ready to go up on you, or you're just thinking about whether it makes sense for you to buy right now, reach out to us and I'll do a free evaluation to see if it makes sense for you, on your own personal level. 877-245-2030, 877-245-2030. When we come back, we're going to jump into a couple articles in CNN Money on short sale fraud that's been plaguing the housing market, and also robo-signing foreclosures have not gone away. Be right back.